Hey guys, so we're going to focus on 4.3 today. We've already covered the history of cell biology and we already covered the intro to cells. Now we're going to talk about cell organelles and features. We're talking about eukaryotic cells or cells that have a nucleus as well as membrane-bound organelles. Okay, so the objective of this section is to describe the structure and function of a cell's plasma membrane, to summarize the role of a nucleus, which we mentioned before, to list the major organelles found in the cytosol and describe their roles, to identify the characteristics of the mitochondria, and to describe the structure and function of what we call the cytoskeleton. So let's start first with the plasma membrane. The plasma membrane is made out of lipids, which we talked about in chapter 3. So the cell membrane consists of what they call a phospholipid bilayer. This means that it's a layer of both phosphorus and lipids, okay? But not only is it one layer, it's two layers, and we'll talk more about that here, okay? You can see the structure of this phospholipid bilayer. It has sorry, it has you'll notice the tails point inward and the heads of the bilayer point outward. That's because the heads are hydrophilic or water loving, and the tails are hydrophobic or they don't like water. So that's why the shape of the layer is like this, because if the tails were pointing outwards, then they could dissolve. You also see it like here, so it says cell membranes often contain proteins within this bilayer, and this layer pretty much has openings in it where it lets some things through and not others. Some things are able to dissolve through the lipid bilayer here, others have to take these transport proteins in order to get into and out of the cell. We talk more about the plasma membrane. It refers to it being made of the fluid mosaic model, which states that the bilayer behaves more like a fluid than it does a solid. Okay, so even though it is a layer of protection around the cell that lets some things through and not others, it behaves more like a fluid than it would a solid. Okay, let's talk more about the organelles that are inside these cells. So one, first and foremost, is the nucleus. This is like the brain of the cell. This controls and directs the cell's activities. This is also where the cell has DNA stored. Here's the nucleus. You could see it here. It's the largest part of the cell. It's in the center here. Inside of the nucleus is a part that they call the nucleolus, and it's surrounded by this nuclear envelope. So this entire red thing here is the nucleus, nucleolus, nuclear envelope surrounding the nucleus. And then as you can see right here, the nucleus is by and large the largest organelle in the cell. As I mentioned, the nucleus has a nuclear envelope, or basically has a double membrane that surrounds it. It's just its own layer of protection for the inside of the nucleus, where the DNA and the nucleolus is. The nucleolus is the place where DNA is concentrated in the center of the nucleus, and it's also where something called ribosomal RNA or rRNA is synthesized, which is going to be important later on when we talk about protein synthesis in chapter 7. All right, this little jelly bean thing here is the mitochondria. If there's one thing that you remember throughout biology that most students take with them, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Okay, so the mitochondria harvests energy from organic compounds and it transfers it to ATP, which is the molecule that your cells use to release energy. Ribosomes, here's another important thing in the cell. These are essentially the protein factories of the cell. They're either free floating or they exist somewhere in the cytoplasm inside of the cell, or they are attached to the ER, which we'll talk about what that organelle is. The part of the ER that has these is referred to as the rough ER. So again, the ribosomes can either be free floating inside of the cytoplasm or they could be attached to the endoplasmic reticulum, in which we call the rough ER, which we'll talk about in a few slides. They're basically protein factories inside the cell. All right, ER is the endoplasmic reticulum. This is basically the highway of the cell. This is where proteins are prepared for export, as well as are basically shipped throughout the cell. So the rough ER contains ribosomes inside of it. Those ribosomes make proteins, and they use the ER as a pathway to get to other parts of the cell. There's also the smooth ER, which doesn't have ribosomes in it. And instead of containing the ribosomes for the protein factories, this is where lipids are built, and also this is where the highway where those would travel throughout the cell for the detoxification of toxins. The Golgi apparatus, this is another important cell organelle. This is basically UPS as far as the cell goes. This is where things are processed and packaged in the cell, including proteins, but as well as other materials. When it packages them, that packages them into a thing called vesicles, which are basically bubbles that contain different things. So it says here, as far as protein synthesis goes, which we'll talk about in chapter 7, the rough ER, the Golgi apparatus, and the vesicles that they're packaged in work together to transport proteins to their destination, both inside and outside the cell. This just shows processing proteins. If you want to pause here and read the diagram, feel free to. Okay. Some last parts of this before we finish 4.3. The cytoskeleton. This is made of protein fibers that help the cell move and maintain their shape. The three major parts of the cytoskeleton that basically maintains the skeleton of the cytoplasm inside of the cells is microtubules, microfilaments, and what's called intermediate filaments. We talk about cells. Two major parts of cells that we talk about are cilia and flagella. These are basically two different methods for cells to move with. Cilia are hair-like bristles that are all over the entire body of the cell, and they extend from the surface of the cell to assist in movement. Flagella, on the other hand, is more of a tail, which is on the end of the cell, and it kind of acts as a motor would on a boat, and it propels the cell forward. Last but not least, we talk about the centrioles. Centrioles are two short cylinders of microtubules, which we talked about previously, that assist in the cytoskeleton. And these, again, we'll talk about at a later time when we mention cell division. Okay, and that's it for 4.3 in this section. When we talk next time, we'll be talking all about plant cells and what is unique to plant cells. Okay, but that's everything to do with the vast majority of the organelles. I know it's a lot, but that's okay because we're going to be practicing these organelles throughout the rest of the week and learning about them.